Good evening, everyone. Hope your week is treating you well so far. We are in the midst of a heat wave, or were, at least as of yesterday, but nevertheless, it was absolutely beautiful, gorgeous outside. Thankfully, most of the snow and ice is gone, but it can't go away quick enough, if I say so myself. But nevertheless, it has definitely been good. This evening, as we dive back off into the book of Daniel, we're going to be looking into Daniel chapter 2 this evening. And as we start, we are definitely starting to kind of kick off into some of the reasons why Daniel and his friends, they begin to gain favor through the eyes of Nebuchadnezzar, and just even into the upper echelon of what is going on through the Babylonian Empire. And so this evening, as we begin to kick off, we'll find our place in Daniel chapter 2, verse 1. And we are going to actually try to go through verse 13 this evening to try to kind of get through that as one just section there. So this evening, as you see on the screen there, it says, "In the second year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams that troubled him, and sleep deserted him. So the king gave orders to summon the diviners, priests, mediums, sorcerers, and Chaldeans to tell the king his dreams. And when they came and stood before the king, he said to them, 'I have had a dream, am anxious to understand it.' In verse 4 it says, 'The Chaldeans spoke to the king, "May the king live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will give the interpretation." And the king replied to the Chaldeans, "My word is final. If you do not tell me the dream and its interpretation, you will be torn limb from limb, and your houses will be made a garbage dump. But if you make the dream and its interpretation known to me, you'll receive gifts, a reward, and a great honor from me. So make the dream and its interpretation known to me." Now they respond back a second time, "May the king tell the dream to his servants, and we will give the interpretation." The king replied, "I know for certain you are trying to gain some time, because you see that my word is final. If you don't tell me the dream, there is one decree for you. You have conspired to tell me something false or fraudulent until the situation changes. So tell me the dream, and I will know you can give me its interpretation." And the Chaldeans answered the king, "No one on earth can make known what the king requests. And consequently, no king, however great and powerful, has ever asked anything like this of any diviner, priest, medium, or Chaldean. What the king is asking is so difficult that no one can make it known to him except the gods, whose dwelling is not with mortals." And so because of that, the king became violently angry and gave orders to destroy all of the wise men of Babylon. And the decree was issued that the wise men were to be executed, and they searched for Daniel and his friends to execute them. So tonight, as we begin to dive off into chapter 2 here in the verses 1 through 13, just a couple of quick things I want us to think about. In chapter 2 there, verse 1 says, "In the second year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams and troubled him, and sleep deserted him." So I want us to kind of think through the logic and just even the chronological order of things as we begin to understand this. The dream is significant as we dive off into chapter 2, because this is our first description of there being 4 other kingdoms. And I'm going to say this kind of repeatedly, continually as we walk through this book, because I want us to make sure that we understand the order of things. And so there again, the first of order is the Babylonians. We're talking about the empires and the vision that we're going to see here in chapter 2. First is the Babylonians. Second is always going to be the Medes and the Persians. The third is always going to be the Greek Empire. And then the fourth is going to be the Roman Empire. So as we talk about the dream or the statue and even the animals that come out later on in chapter 7 and 8, we're going to be going back to kind of this continual affirmation of the order of the kings, okay? Or that is the kingdom. So Babylonians, Medes and the Persians, Greeks, and then the Romans. And so just to kind of give you that idea, of course, it is going to share the vision of the four empires that will rule over the world, and it eventually speaks to the empire or what is going to happen at Christ's return and the apocalypse beginning. So just there again, things that we need to discuss in order to kind of set the time frame. And the standard chronological time frame is key right now in chapter 2, verse 1. If you were to break it down, you have the year of ascension in 605 BC. The first year is in 604 BC, and the second year is 603 BC. So in essence, what we're finding out of chapter 2, verse 1 is Daniel and his friends, they are potentially about to come out of their training, but they're potentially not fully there yet. We don't know fully chronologically kind of what the time gap looks like, but you're seeing kind of that transition potentially out of the training into the actual being assimilated into the kingdom of Babylon itself. And this is potentially why Daniel was not called upon as it relates to specifically as we dive off into these verses. It kind of gives us a potential reason as to why, an explanation is there. Given the background, there again, to kind of consider where Daniel's at, he is maybe 17 or 18 years old. He is not gray-headed. He does not have, this huge long white beard of wisdom, and, it's nothing like that. This is taking place whenever he is, in our terminology, still a child, okay? So that's something definitely that we have to keep in the background. The text only gives credence to one dream, not multiple. So we have to be careful of thinking like, yes, it mentions dreams almost pluralistically, but overall it's but one dream, okay, that Nebuchadnezzar has had, and everything begins to unfold out of that. But we learn in chapter 2 there, verse 1, it troubled him. It was a dream that shook him to his core. It was something that he could not let go of. I mean, even as it talks about there afterwards, it led to more sleepless nights. I mean, it was something that Nebuchadnezzar it laid strongly on his heart and his mind, and he couldn't shake it. And so in essence, that's where he begins to do something about it. Of course, the Babylonians believed messages were visions given from the gods. So Nebuchadnezzar's first inclination is to look and say, what are the gods trying to tell me? What are they trying to prepare me for? Or, prophesy about in a roundabout way? What are they trying to give me a heads up towards about something positive, something destructive and negative? All of these things are naturally going to flood the king's mind. Of course, there you see it's going to worry Nebuchadnezzar because potentially the future of the kingdom is at stake. And so there is a lot riding on the line in Nebuchadnezzar's way of thinking. And I think we'll see that as to how strongly it was weighing on his mind as we continue to work through this. So in chapter 2, verse 2, it says, So the king gave orders to summon the diviner priests, mediums, sorcerers, and Chaldeans to the king, or to tell the king his dreams. And when they came and stood before the king, we'll kind of dive off into that in a second there. But in terms of chapter 2, verse 2 there, I want us to go back to this idea of even in the Exodus, as we find there in Exodus chapter 7, verse 1, Pharaoh did the same thing. He called for the sorcerers and the astrologers, all these people to come before him in the same kind of manner, in the same kind of principle. It tells us that it's a common practice of how things were done in the Old Testament, apart from God, of course, but still. And then if you go over into Exodus chapter 22, verse 18, it talks about there that sorcery was condemned in the Old Testament, but it specifically says in verse 18 there, that they are to be put to death. So obviously, clearly, distinctly, God is giving a separation of saying like what level I am on cannot be touched. Like anything close to that, it's got to be destroyed. We've got to get rid of it. And so there's definitely a fine line of interpretation, especially into the way that Daniel and the others would have been thinking, even versus how Nebuchadnezzar was thinking. They were in two polar opposite camps naturally, even as we saw out of chapter 1 in relation to the dietary restrictions and all the other things. God was clearly moving and working on their behalf. But at least kind of thinking about the background contextually, socially, religiously, even as the Babylonians were understanding. Astrology was a practice of the Babylonians, but many scientific things, but mainly scientific in nature. It wasn't that they used astrology really to listen for, but it was a way of I would say even developing the scientific method, and if you think of what it means to come up with your thesis statement and everything else of what you're after, so much that the Babylonian astronomer, you're going to see it on the screen there, and if you want to take a shot in the dark as to how to say the name, you're more than welcome, but Nebuchadnezzar is how I'm going to go with, but nevertheless in 500 BC was able to calculate the length of the year at 365 days, 6 hours and 15 minutes and 41 seconds. What is crazy is he was only 26 minutes and 55 seconds too long or off of the mark. So if anything, that realization came out through the Babylonian Empire, that is, as it relates to 500 BC, okay? So thinking about that side of it, it kind of proves that there is a scientific method that was behind it, but still, the overarching point of it is there was something deeper the king was after. So let's think real quickly about verse 3. There in chapter 2, verse 2, when they came and stood before the king, it says in chapter 2, verse 3 there, he said to them, I have had a dream and am anxious to understand it. And the Chaldeans spoke to the king, May the king live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will give the interpretation. Okay, so the wise men of Babylon, they're all assembled, they're brought together, the sorcerers, the magicians, astrologers, anybody and everybody. And what do they begin to do? In verse 3 there it says, he said to them, I am anxious because of this, but it says, they spoke to the king, May the king live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will give the interpretation. So they are making a bold prediction of, we are going to be able to interpret the dream, okay? Again, I would say that is very uncanny of them right now. It is, again, it's a trick. It is something that they've learned in their, way of life and everything else. It's a scheme that they're playing on, okay? So, here's where they make this justification to the king of, hey, you've told us about this dream, tell it to us. Because we can't do our jobs unless we know what is going on. So they had to know the dream so they could apply their own justified logic as to its interpretation. They needed to know the dream in order to say, oh, well, this is how this is connected, and, start bridging the gaps and basically covering themselves in the long run, okay? But here's the thing, to the ignorant mind, they could manipulate it to make the dream sound however they wanted. Now here's the thing, was Nebuchadnezzar ignorant? No. That was, I would suggest, potentially one of their greatest mistakes, was looking at the king and trying to say, this is what you need to do. There's a respect in leadership and positions, presidency, world leadership, whatever. But at this point, I think it would behoove these individuals to sit still and be quiet for a second and gain the information. They jumped out of the gate too early to try to figure out what was on the king's mind, and in essence, they dug themselves down into a pit that they could not get out of. So much that if we look in verse 5, it says, the king replied to the Chaldeans, my word is final. If you don't tell me the dream and its interpretation, you will be torn limb from limb, and your house will be made a garbage dump. Okay, so let's think about this. In chapter 2, verse 5, literally, whenever it's talking here, torn limb from limb, chopped into pieces, all this, it means hacked up in Aramaic, and literally you are dismembered and pulled apart limb by limb. I don't want to explain how that was all possible, but there were devices, there were things that made that a reality, and it would have not been a pretty sight. So, unfortunately, this is a common practice that Babylonians and other empires would use against their enemies. About 100 years later after this, there's actually a record of, Darius I, who virtually annihilated most of his wise men in this same kind of way. But there again, just kind of a commonality, but kind of going to that third point there, it was not just the individual, but included the families. And of course, as it talks about in verse 5 there, they would potentially burn their houses down. They would literally, their dwelling place would be turned into an actual literal garbage dump, a place where people would go and drop off their trash. Why? Because it was symbolic of that individual. He wronged the king. He did something that was uncanny of himself that he shouldn't have done, and he didn't get away with. That was kind of like their way of saying, like, you know, curse on you, curse on your family, like you mean nothing good whatsoever. So that's a lot to interpret and a lot to take in, but yet we find, you know, this word, or these words in verse 5 here. The king replied to the Chaldeans, "My word is final." In essence, this is Nebuchadnezzar saying, guess what, guys? Normally I may tell you the dream, but not today. I'm not falling for your tricks and your manipulation. So let's dive off into this. In verses 6 through 7 there, it says, "But if you make the dream and its interpretation known to me, you'll receive gifts, a reward, and great honor from me. So make the dream and its interpretation known to me." And again, what does it say in verse 7 there? They answered a second time, "May the king tell the dream to his servants, and we will give the interpretation." You know, obviously, if they were real, if they were true, if this was a valid way of life, any one of them should have been able to step up and say, "Oh, yes, here's your answer, king," and run with it. But why aren't they? Well, you know, I think it kind of speaks for itself. It's because they have no clue what they are doing. The king knows who they are. He knows their character and all of these things so much that, think about this. The reward could have been positions of power. It could have been marriage to a daughter of the king, etc. Who knows? Like, I mean, literally, Nebuchadnezzar is going out on a limb to say, you could have your pick of the litter. You could have your pick of position. Like, all you got to do is tell me. And literally, you will never have to worry about a thing again. I mean, that's pretty bold. That's a big statement. But yet, they're scrambling. Why? He is calling their bluff. Of course, as you can see there, it's a big gamble. You know, the buck, so to speak, stops at the end of verse 6 there. Instead of the king speaking the dream, they had to tell him. They had to tell him, this is what you just dreamed, and the interpretation thereof. They were obviously past the point of no return. They were out on a limb, and this is where you get that gut feeling of, oh no, I have stepped off the deep end. I am in trouble. Like, I cannot save myself at this point. I mean, clearly, evidently, it was all they could do to figure out, okay, we got ourselves into this. How do we get ourselves out of it? But nevertheless, I want to kind of read through verses 8 through 13 there. It says, "The king replied, I know for certain you are trying to gain some time, because you see that my word is final. If you don't tell me the dream, there is one decree for you. You have conspired to tell me something false or fraudulent until the situation changes. So tell me the dream, and I will know you can give me its interpretation." And so the Chaldeans answered the king, "No one on earth can make known what the king requests. Consequently, no king, however great and powerful, has ever asked anything like this of any diviner, priest, medium, or Chaldean. And what the king is asking is so difficult that no one can make it known to him except the gods whose dwelling is not with mortals." Because of this, the king became violently angry and gave orders to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. And the decree was issued that the wise men were to be executed. And then we see there that they searched for Daniel and his friends to execute them. So just kind of thinking through verses 8 through 13 here real quick. Whoever could tell the dream had to be in contact with the spirits. That was, in essence, what they were saying. Because of the non-disclosure of the dream, the king was having doubts that these men were just fake. That he was looking at them saying, I know who you are. I'm done playing these games. You're either real or you're not. If you're not, you stood on your leg. It didn't, and it's just not going to work out well for you. I mean, stop and think about what their argument is. What they're saying to the king, And Nebuchadnezzar saying, I'm done with all this. Like, this is too serious of a matter for me to not to take this kind of action with it. So most likely these wise men were going to be rounded up for a formal execution, and they were just beginning to gather all these wise men, as we find out here in chapter 2, verses 12 and 13 there. He begins to bring them all together, and the goal is a formal execution. But Daniel and his friends at this point, more or less, did they have any direct involvement? Were they, called or invited to be a part of this? More than likely not. But imagine the king's rage. There again, we learn in verse 12 there, the king became violently angry. In essence, Daniel and his friends, they were guilty by association. It didn't have anything to do with them, but they were just thrown into the ring of, okay, let's cut our losses and start over. So, to kind of wrap up chapter 2 here, verses 1 through 13, we're going to leave off on this note, okay? That Daniel and his friends are on the brink of execution, and what's going to happen? Well, I would hope you know the answer, but nevertheless, if you don't, tune in next week to find out. But as we close on a point of application, here's one thing I want you to know. Lying can only get you so far. For these magicians, astrologers, wise men, so to speak, their lives were a house of cards. And whenever the king called their bluff, that house of cards came tumbling down. Lying is such a temptation to escape trouble or to escape, fear, whatever the case is. But we learn in John chapter 8, and even what I've been preaching on Sunday mornings, the truth is what sets us free. It's our faith and freedom in Christ that is ultimately going to help us to be set free from the things of this world. So always remember, lying can only get you so far, but even when threats are made towards you, trust that God will come through. Imagine to their surprise, here's this incident basically. They're just all of a sudden finding out about it. I'm talking Daniel and his friends, and they're saying, what? Wait, I had nothing to do with this. And Azariah or somebody else in the temple guard is saying, sorry, doesn't work that way. Like, yeah, you didn't potentially have anything to do with it, but you got to die. Like, that would be tough to, handle. That would be a lot to process of, I didn't do anything and I'm already guilty. It speaks to that side that, threats were clearly being made towards them, but ultimately, trust that God will come through. Does God come through for these men? Yes, He does. We'll learn about that next week. But we have to come to that same point of saying, God, we have to trust in You. Even whenever the future seems bleak or it seems impossible, God is able. And we have to remember that. God is the one who is writing this story and who is continuing it on each and every single day. Yes, we are people that are involved within this, but God is the director. God is the one that is moving behind it all. And I think it would behoove us to consider what our faith looks like in moments of trials and tribulation, of asking ourselves, God, do I believe? As Romans 8:28 stipulates, God works good towards those who love Him, who are called according to His purpose. In those moments, do we really stop and say, God, it's hard to see right now, but You're working good? For Daniel and his friends, I could easily see, God, I don't see how, how all this makes sense. But they trusted that God would be good, and God was good. So, learn lessons from Scripture. That's what it's here for. It's to teach us and to grow us in wisdom and knowledge as to how God works, how God moves on behalf of His people. But I hope and pray you'll join us next week to continue on in chapter 2 as we learn about the dream and Daniel's intervention and interaction within it all. But I hope you all have a great and wonderful rest of your week. If you need anything, please let me know. But otherwise, I guess we'll see you next time. Thank you, guys.